Welcome back, everybody, to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry, and in today's course, we're going to be talking about bash scripting for system administrators. In this video, we're going to take a step back before we kind of jump into the meat and potatoes of bash scripting, and we're going to talk about a brief history of the bash shell itself. So let's go ahead and get started. So we kind of have to back up to talk about the shell itself. And the shell, or any shells on a Unix-compatible system, of which Linux is one type, are often called command line interpreters. And they began with the first Unix shell back in 1971, called the V6 shell, Unix V6, back in the late 60s, early 70s. It was written by Ken Thompson from Bell Labs, and all of the early Unix stuff came out of AT&T's Bell Labs. Bell Labs developed the initial sysvinit type of Unix systems, and you'll often see not only these kinds of files and utilities that are part of the early versions of Unix, but you'll also see things like C, which was originally written also by personnel at Bell Labs. In this case, this particular shell, which was simply called binsh, was a user program that executed from outside of the kernel. It gave you a way of interacting with the file system and the utilities that are installed on the system. Many of the things we have come to expect from bash were added after the initial shell's development. In this case, added after the binsh. It had a lot of functionality when it was developed in 1971, but a lot of that stuff continued to be built upon as it was used throughout the early 70s. But it did introduce many of the common aspects of our current shells, including bash, like redirection and piping, as well as the ability to handle sequential and asynchronous commands. In 1977, the Bourne shell was introduced, having been created by Stephen Bourne, also at Bell Labs, for V7 Unix. Now, the Bourne shell itself was written with one of the main goals being to support interactive execution of commands for the operating system, and it's often seen as the beginning or the birth of shell scripting. And it wasn't that shell, the binsh before the Bourne shell, wasn't used for what we view as shell scripting, but really one of the primary goals for the Bourne shell when it was created was doing exactly that. It introduced a lot of the more advanced concepts into the shell, and scripting capabilities such as control structures, extremely important, if, while, case, as well as signal handling and command substitution. So it allowed us to do a lot of the modern flow control that you expect input and output for any shell script. And these shells, particularly the Bourne shell, gave birth to a large number of shells that we've all heard of, whether it's Quorn, Almquist, C shell, and eventually the Born Again shell, which we refer to as bash. So the Born Again shell, also called bash, is an open source GNU project that was intended to completely replace the Bourne shell. It was developed by Brian Fox and has become the standard shell for almost all Linux distributions over time. Bash incorporates full compatibility with the previous Bourne shell, and in fact, most shell scripts that are written with the Bourne shell in mind can be run without change in the Born Again bash shell. It also included the incorporation of features from some other shells that were written at the time as well, such as the Quorn and the C shell. In addition to basic scripting that's always been a part of Bourne, bash provides the ability to define functions, including regular expressions and associative arrays, among other advanced features. So what bash did, in addition to inheriting all of the characteristics of the Bourne shell, and simply it could have called it good at that point and changed the license type so that it was more compatible with Linux, for example, because you'll see that bash is also released under the GPL rather than the BSD license. Bash also gave us the ability as administrators to be more development central in how we structure and call the structures within our shell scripts. It gives us the ability to do functions, which is a huge difference from something that we had to be very iterative or linear in type in the past. We can now have advanced control structures from within our bash shell scripts and function more as a true development than simply execute A, B, and C in that particular order. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes just talking about bash, because I know that sometimes we get mired down in the details of a concept, a tool, or a utility, and we really have no knowledge about where it came from and why. So I just wanted to take a step back to understand and acknowledge how we got to where we are. It's not going to inform a lot of the rest of the course, but if anybody asks how we ended up using bash, you'll at least have an idea of where we started from. That's all for the history of bash. My name is Terry for Linux Academy.